The increase in interest rates by the US Federal Reserve, the rout in the Shanghai and Shenzhen stock exchanges, and the further downward movement in the price of oil are indications that we are in for a bumpy year. On the political front, similarly, recent events such as the parliamentary elections in Myanmar, the rejection of the draft constitution in Thailand, and the changing contours of the Philippine presidential election similarly signal that this year will be a defining one for the region. To help us understand the implications of these and other developments, we have two very distinguished panelists joining us. The first, on the far end of the stage, Mr. Manu Bhaskaran, is CEO of Centennial Asia Advisors, a research and strategy firm. He will take us through the economic prospects for Southeast Asia. The second, Carlisle Thayer, is Emeritus Professor at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and he will lay out the key political stress points for the region. Each panelist will speak for about 12 minutes, after which we will proceed to Q&A. I would like to first invite Mr. Bhaskaran to give us his take on the economic prospects for the region.
Thank you, Francis. I'd like to thank the Institute for inviting me to speak, and I'd like to wish you all a very happy new year. Despite all the gloom, I have the task of persuading you in 12 minutes that the world is not as bad as it might seem from the headlines, at least as far as the economy is concerned. Personally, I think that the global economy, in terms of its demand for ASEAN exports, is probably going to turn out somewhat better than expected. I don't think we should underestimate the slow but reinforcing recoveries in the G3 economies, now further strengthened by lower oil prices, and I think that will help external demand. Secondly, we had a whole range of domestic impediments to growth in the last couple of years. I think some of these at the margin are going to ease, and that should help us as well. This is not to say that there are no risks. I completely concede that there are some important risks from China, the potential financial stresses as US monetary policy normalizes, and domestic politics remains a question. I think there will be unpleasant surprises as we go through the year, but I also believe that these can be contained if the rest of the economies are doing quite well. So let me first sketch out very quickly the broad outlines of why I think global demand will be relatively good for ASEAN. The story really starts with the United States, where, to cut a long story short, what we are seeing is gradual, slow improvements in the labor market, in the housing market, in bank lending, business confidence, reinforcing each other to produce gradually stronger growth. The US economy in the last few years has been very volatile, and quarter to quarter you do get some unexpected slowdowns, as we saw in the fourth quarter of last year. But if you take a step back and look at the underlying trend, it is, I would argue, a largely positive one. There are some financial stresses, high yield debt and so on. The dollar is probably too strong for the manufacturing sector, but by and large, the overall picture is a good and improving one. In both the Eurozone and Japan, we have fragile recoveries gradually gaining more strength. And I think, barring any political setback, we will see a significant pickup in the Eurozone and modest one in Japan, and that will be good for ASEAN. Among the emerging markets, we have a very mixed bag outside China. It is not all bad news. If you look at some of the big emerging markets like India, Mexico, probably Iran, Central Europe, they're doing reasonably well. Brazil and Turkey, South Africa are doing very poorly. And it is basically those countries that didn't get their basics right, that did not diversify their economies when they had a chance, that will underperform. Overall, more than half the world economy will be accelerating. And fortunately for ASEAN, that is the half that ASEAN exports are geared to. What about China? There is certainly a major problem in China, and it's all the more difficult for us to interpret China because some of the data is not very clear. But some things are quite clear. In terms of the activity levels, manufacturing is in recession, but the services sector is doing reasonably well. We are seeing financial stresses beginning to widen. We are seeing the increase in bad loans, in bond defaults. We are seeing profit margins being squeezed and the number of loss-making enterprises, including state enterprises, increasing significantly. Real estate prices seem to have stabilized, but I think this is a temporary thing, and we will probably see further downside in the economy as a result. So what we have is a situation where the policymakers are now rejigging their policy and becoming much more activist and vigorous in their response. Unfortunately, the one thing that has significantly changed in terms of how we view China in the last few weeks has been that the credibility and the confidence that others, both domestic players as well as foreign investors, had in China, Chinese policymaking, has diminished because of some of the missteps that we have seen with respect to the stock market, with respect to the management of the exchange rate. And that is certainly a worry. Policy is also affected because some of the dimensions of their overall policy posture, including the anti-corruption crackdown, unfortunately has some deleterious effects on economic growth at the same time. So we're going to see a big push in terms of supply-side reforms, and I think the long-term transformation of the Chinese economy is probably intact, but what I worry about is the cyclical challenges and whether those can be managed competently. My fear is that, not that China will crash. I mean, there are some observers who can never forgive China for not crashing, but I'm not one of those. I think China will not crash, but it will go through several episodes of significant stress, and that stress will be communicated through financial markets, principally to us. So if you look at the various channels by which ASEAN economies are affected by China, the first is, of course, Chinese imports from ASEAN. A lot of this is in the commodity side, and some of it is in the intermediate component side. I think this element of the damage has been largely absorbed, and I don't see it getting significantly worse this year. In terms of services impact, tourism is very important. The Chinese economy is going to slow down, but fortunately for us, household sector is benefiting from a tight labor market. Wages are rising, and more people are going out as tourists. So that part, that channel of transmission to ASEAN is less affected. Commodity prices have already fallen, and I don't think they will fall significantly more. Outside energy and base metals, the impact on the kind of commodity prices that we are exposed to, crude palm oil and rice and tapioca and so on, is much less from China. In terms of the capital markets, we are going to see significant stresses as a result of China, as I mentioned. In terms of currency, the yuan is probably going to depreciate, and that's going to exert some downward pressures on ASEAN currencies. The real concern I have is that I think China is going to dump a lot of its excess capacity on world markets, and that's going to cause industrial goods prices to fall. That's going to provoke all kinds of reactions, including protectionism in the rest of the world. So basically, we are going to have deflationary pressures. Oil prices, commodity prices, industrial goods prices are going to hurt. What about the domestic side? Over the last couple of years, we've seen some pretty bold reforms in Malaysia and Indonesia, removal of fuel subsidies, introduction of a GST in Malaysia, and so on. These are extremely positive for the long term, but in the near term, they did damage demand, hitting consumer confidence and business confidence. We've also had a plethora of macroprudential regulations to rein in credit demand, to cool property sectors. The negative effects of these have now been absorbed, and I suspect at the margin, these domestic headwinds are now going to ease. So that's a positive. What about the risks? Politics remains a major concern for me. But again here, at the margin, if you look at Malaysia, for instance, the Prime Minister seems to have got over the worst, and with a bit of luck, I think politics will not create the kind of damage we saw in 2015, with the hit to the currency and so on. In Indonesia, President Jokowi is gradually, I think, coming to grips with the levers of power. He still faces immense challenges, but again, one gets the sense that his cabinet is beginning to function more effectively, fiscal disbursements are rising, and the impact on the economy could be more positive. In Vietnam, which is really beginning to rise again, we should see a leadership change announced very soon, and I suspect that will be supportive of reform. Capital flows will be a huge problem for us. Capital markets are in disarray. There's great uncertainty about China, about the speed with which the US monetary normalization will be conducted. And we've got lots of distortions after 7 to 8 years of ultra-easy, mispriced risk assets. There are bound to be little explosions everywhere that will create problems for the capital markets. And I think that's something we will just have to learn to deal with. What's the net impact on the major economies in ASEAN? This is a rather busy chart, but let me just make a couple of points. I think the key factors that will determine which countries do better or worse will be, first of all, how exposed they are to the uplift in demand coming from the US, Eurozone, and Japan. I think the second thing is, are there financial vulnerabilities in those economies that could amplify an external shock and make it a destabilizing one? Thirdly, how credible is monetary policy, which is quite often the anchor that provides stability to currencies and business confidence? Fourthly, is the domestic economic cycle anyway turning up, which will help give that extra lift to the economy? And finally, will political risks impede recovery? If you put all these together, I think most of ASEAN is in reasonably good shape. I worry a bit about Indonesia because I think the currency is under pressure. They have been clearly intervening in the foreign exchange markets, using very scarce foreign exchange reserves to do so. And at some point, I think that may be unsustainable. Thailand is already turning around quite dramatically. If you see the latest data in December, across a whole range of indicators, consumer confidence, private sector investment, and so on, we're seeing significant improvement. So Thailand may have got the worst behind it, so long as politics does not get in the way. Malaysia, everyone sees Malaysia as a play on oil prices. It is much, much more than that. 80% of Malaysia's exports are in the manufactured area. What it loses in oil prices is more than compensated by the benefits of oil prices boosting demand in the G3. Outside Hong Kong and Singapore, two city-state economies, Malaysia is the most open economy in the world. It will be a big beneficiary from G3 recovery. Singapore as well, we are dominated by external demand. More than 80% of our total demand is from external sources. We will benefit to that. However, domestically, we have a corporate sector that is struggling with a loss of competitiveness and with high costs. There's a certain amount of deflationary adjustment that's going on that will slow the economy to some extent. Net, we should do slightly better this year than last year. In the Philippines, we are seeing some of the major drivers of recent high growth, business process outsourcing, remittances beginning to slow down. We have an election year uncertainty as well. I think the Philippine economy will, broadly speaking, do better than last year, but there are increasing risks. So the real conclusion is not this bunch of words here, but keep calm and carry on. I think global demand is going to be better than people think. In the domestic side of the economy, inflationary pressures are under control. The central banks are likely to be able to do a lot more for the economy than people think. The main challenges in terms of external threats to financial markets and domestic political risk, I think in that context, can probably be managed. So let me end here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bhaskaran. May I now invite Professor Thayer to speak on regional political trends.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank ISIS for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm going to concentrate on 4 countries, Vietnam, Myanmar, Philippines, and Thailand. Indonesia and Malaysia are being considered in special sessions to follow. So the ASEAN community is going to enter a new stage this year in 2016, and its attempt at community building will be tested by political transitions underway in Myanmar and Thailand. And as we've heard from the director this morning, new leaders will take office in Vietnam, Myanmar, and the Philippines. And Thailand's transition from military rule to civilian government will continue to be a work in progress. So now let me turn to Vietnam, and with each country I'll give an overview and some markers. Its 12th National Party Congress is going to be held from January 20th to 28th. There will be no surprises in broad policy terms. The draft political report has been released and approved. The 5-year socioeconomic plan up to the year 2020 has also been released. What is important is that the delegates to this Congress will elect the new Central Committee. And on the last day of the Congress, the Central Committee will elect the Politburo, and from among the members of the Politburo will elect the new leaders. And the delegates in the past have demanded a choice, not just one, so that's an open space. Vietnam has a retirement policy. I wouldn't be speaking to you. You have to be, if you're over 65, you retire. If you've held 2 terms in office, you retire. Exemptions can be given in special cases. This year, of the 16-member Politburo, only 5 would be qualified if all the others who met those retirement ages left, and 2 who are so new they can't get up. So sometime during the next week, a 14th meeting of the Central Committee is expected to vote on the candidates for the top 4 posts. And I see 4 markers. Who will be the next party leader? Well, the current Prime Minister, Nguyen Thanh Dung, has reportedly thrown his hat in the ring to be the new party Secretary General. He's over 65, he's served 2 terms. And what he's attempting to do is unprecedented. It's like Vladimir Putin in Russia. You're president one time, prime minister. In this case, prime minister and secretary general. No one has retired from a top office in Vietnam and then tried to hang on to another top office. You've just gone. He would bring extraordinary international experience and knowledge of global economics to that office in a way that no previous party secretary general has had. And once they've chosen the prime minister, it's not a winner-take-all system. Vietnam will carefully balance the new Secretary General's powers, if it is Nguyen Thanh Dung, with others. So who will be state president? Who will be prime minister? Will it be a protege of Nguyen Thanh Dung? Who will head the National Assembly? Policy changes that are new aren't surprising, though. It will deepen ties with the United States, mainly on the economic side, and particularly if the TPP is passed through Congress. The policy changes are the 3rd marker. The 4th marker are National Assembly elections will be held in May this year, and a new cabinet will be appointed. And it's clear, we'll know once the party Congress is over who is likely to take cabinet positions. But the National Assembly in the past has rejected on a few occasions nominees. Let me turn to Myanmar. The November 2015 election was generally free and fair. It resulted in a landslide victory for the National League for Democracy. Daw Aung San Suu Kyi won a popular mandate for change, 79% in the National Assembly, both houses, more than 75% in the 7 state assemblies and 4 of the 7 ethnic minority assemblies. But the military, the Tatmadaw, is entitled to hold 25% of all seats, and they control 3 ministries that she cannot appoint: Defense, Home Affairs, and Border Security. And the military can block changes to the Constitution. So for Myanmar, the elections only signal a new phase of political contestation in Myanmar, not the dawn of democracy and not the end of military rule, but a prolonged contestation. Let me look at 7 markers. First, the government won't take office until March, and then it will elect the speakers for the People's Assembly and the House of Nationality. That should be a foregone conclusion. The National League for Democracy has the majority of votes. More contentious is the election of the president, and the president does not have to be an elected deputy. Aung San Suu Kyi is forbidden from being president, but she has stated she would rule from above. So who will be the new president? That's very important. The military itself has presented a bill that would limit the powers of a future president. Once and the lower house, the upper house, and the military all caucus separately and come up with a candidate. So there'll be 3 for president. Then all of them get together and vote. First past the post. The highest is president. Second is first vice president. The third is third vice president. The third marker is what kind of cabinet will the president-elect form? Will the former ruling party, the USDP, be included? Will there be ethnic minority representatives? No ethnic minority was a candidate for the NLD. And what about the military? They're entitled to 3. Aung San Suu Kyi has said, yes, all 3 groups will be represented. The fourth marker is that National League's, now we know from Suu Kyi, that national reconciliation is her top priority. It's national reconciliation among ethnic minorities who voted for change in her party, but don't have political party representation. And the NLD, as I say, has no ethnic minority candidates in the national parliament. In addition, national reconciliation has to occur with the old elite, the military, and Buddhist nationalists, who were so vocal against the Muslim minority Rohingya. The fifth marker is to proceed to expand the ceasefire and peace process with armed ethnic minorities. And Suu Kyi has said that's her top priority. And her NLD is going to hold a Congress with ethnic minorities. But where armed conflict has continued and where groups have not gone into the peace process, it's where the military can run its own policy without the president being able to interfere. They control the natural resources. These are border areas along China's border. This is a very serious and volatile situation. Sixth marker is what priority will the National League for Democracy assign to resolving the Muslim Rohingya issue, including their citizenship rights. They were essentially disenfranchised in this election, and their citizenship papers are not recognized. They haven't got them. And seventh, given the widespread exhalation of change, how will the NLD government go about promoting democracy, social justice, and even attempting to amend the Constitution? And this is not something that's going to occur in 1 year. As I've said, it's a work in progress. So we see a lot of inflection points in Myanmar in this transition period. So now let me turn to the Philippines. Presidential elections will be held on May 19th. There's some real problems here. The campaign period begins this month. There are likely to be 5 candidates for president and 6 for vice president, including 3 from the same political parties. 2 major developments are worth noting and 3 markers. First, up until just after October when the registration closed, Grace Poe, a senator, independent, was seen as the front runner, but she's now been declared ineligible to run by the Commission on Elections, and she's appealed to the Supreme Court. Secondly, the mayor of Davao, Rodrigo Duterte, threw his hat into the presidential ring after the October 16th line for registration. That's being challenged, and that is also likely to go to the Supreme Court. What happens if their names are printed on the ballots, they're found ineligible? Analysts are arguing that millions of voters could be disenfranchised if they vote for either of them. So look at the markers. First is the Supreme Court ruling. What will it decide? If Senator Poe loses, where will her supporters go, or will they be disenfranchised? The second is, can any candidate break free of the pack and emerge as favorite? In your handouts, I have public opinion polls, and we can question their validity. But it's a pack at which people get around 23 to 28% of various polls. So we have 4 or 5 candidates in contested, 2 of whom could be knocked out. Can anybody break free and emerge as a favorite? So we see a close race. But third and most important, can the new president, given a weak support base, build on the legacy of high economic growth, anti-corruption, and reconciliation with Muslims in the South, for all its positives and negatives, positives, I would say, left by retiring President Benito Aquino? Or will corruption and patronage networks sabotage the process of enforcing democracy and governance? Let me turn to Thailand. In September last year, the National Council for Peace and Order rejected a draft constitution by its own nominated Constitutional Drafting Committee. one that it had appointed. So the political calendar has now been set back to zero. Sometime this month, it's expected that a new draft constitution will be submitted. It must be submitted to a public referendum, and if approved, new general elections must be held. It must see that happening sometime around mid-2007. In fact, the current ruling committee is preparing for a transition phase. If the Constitution is rejected again, this would extend military rule. So let me look at the three most important markers. The first is the new Constitution. Will it entrench a continuation of rule by the military and bureaucracy, what the International Crisis Group calls the unelected politicians? Or can it bridge the divide in Thai politics, caricatured as the red versus yellow shirts? So what will the new Constitution do? Two, once it is approved, what about the timing and management and outcome of a national referendum on the draft Constitution? Will that be a point of conferring legitimacy on the electoral process, or will it be divisive and lead to an unclear future? And thirdly, how will Thailand and the military leaders manage royal succession in the event of the incapacitation or death of the current monarch? And it's clear the military has no intention of giving up power an inch until that royal succession is home and host. So now let me conclude. Political change in Myanmar, Thailand, the Philippines, and Vietnam will affect the pace and scope of ASEAN community building in 2016. The trends are generally positive, but there are risks of domestic instability that I've highlighted. Thailand's military junta and the new leaders of Vietnam and the Philippines can be expected to continue their engagement with ASEAN and its community building. Political change in these four Southeast Asian countries, however, raises critical questions about how they will manage relations with China and the United States, and ASEAN community building could be affected by increased rivalry between these two major powers. And I'm not going to go into detail. My scheme is there because the next session looks at great powers in the region. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for presentations that have managed to be, on one hand, comprehensive and on the other, succinct. Before we turn to the floor for questions, I'd like to get in a question to each panelist. First, Manu, could you give us a little bit of a deep dive on Indonesia? We heard a little bit about what's going on in that economy, but it is the region's largest. And if I could ask you to give us a little bit more of how you think, on one hand, low oil prices, low commodity prices on one hand, but at the same time, the fact that it is a large economy, that it is more domestically oriented, so it's also, to a certain extent, buffered from some of the downtrends that we're seeing. But also internally, we've had some interesting initiatives. There's moves to reduce budget underspending on the part of the government, and there's also been moves to cut rates, which we would expect to see have some sort of positive impact. So if you could talk us through that, I would greatly appreciate that. And then, Carl, could you give us a little bit more granularity on the Philippines? So you've mentioned that there are, we know that there are 4 presidential candidates, 1 or 2 of them may be barred. But in the event that, of course, we will see a winner, we do know that in the Philippines, political parties tend to be weak, and it's quite difficult to get sort of policy specifics. But could you give us your take on which of the candidates would be perhaps better at handling the sort of overall business environment on one hand, and the other, of course, is the relationship with China, which has, of course, been a key issue over the past months. So if I could ask Manu first, please.
Thank you, Francis. In a nutshell, I think Indonesia should enjoy a modestly better year in terms of growth, so long as it can manage the external vulnerabilities. So the first driver of that improvement, I think, will simply be the absence of some of the negatives. So we had the big hit to consumer confidence, consumer spending from the fuel subsidy adjustment that came in just after President Joko Widodo took office. Secondly, you had the big hit in terms of commodity prices falling, and that rippled through the economy and created some degree of stress. Thirdly, in anticipation of the fuel subsidy removal and the likely impact on inflation, Bank Indonesia had tightened monetary policy. That too should fall out of the equation. If anything, if the financial markets return to some kind of stability and the currency pressures ease off, I suspect Bank Indonesia will try to ease monetary policy again and help the recovery. In terms of the positive drivers of the economy, one is, I think, a stepped up pace of fiscal disbursement. I think the president realizes that he really has to start delivering on his electoral promises if he is to be re-elected, and I'm pretty certain he wants to be re-elected. And he has made a huge push. He has gone through a couple of cabinet reshuffles. I suspect another one is likely very soon, in order to get ministers who can execute much more competently. And we are beginning to see some effects from that. There's been, I think, 7 stimulus packages announced in the last few months, starting in August. These are not so much stimulus measures as improvements to a whole range of regulations and so on. I think they are largely positive. They're not dramatic in their impact, but they are largely positive. So you add it all up, I think it should be a better year. Now, what can go wrong is, as I briefly mentioned, the external side is under pressure. Some of the metrics for external stability are not looking very good in terms of coverage of debt servicing by foreign exchange reserves and so on. Also, my sense is Bank Indonesia probably has been intervening in financial markets in the foreign exchange markets in the last 2 weeks to keep the rupiah below 14,000, and I suspect they are expending foreign exchange reserves in the process. If that is indeed the case, then I think that might be a risky strategy and expose Indonesia to further stresses if the pressures in the currency markets do not ebb very quickly. And that could expose Indonesia to an abrupt movement in the currency, which would then trigger more financial stresses as well. So I'm a bit concerned about that. But overall, I think that aspect can be managed. I think Indonesia should do well. From a longer-term perspective, a lot of people have focused on how commodity prices are negative for Indonesia. Personally, I think low commodity prices are good for Indonesia. I think the boom in commodity prices of the last 10 years produced what I call lazy growth in Indonesia. It's just coasting along the wave from high commodity prices. There was no real effort to transform the economy, to diversify the economy, to do the heavy lifting in terms of the supply side reforms, infrastructure development. You need to really get the economy moving. Without that crutch of lazy growth, I think policymakers will be forced to do the right things, and over the long term, that should produce higher, longer-term sustainable growth.
Thank you very much.
My question was about the presidential candidates. Start off, I have to hedge because being a president of the Philippines also means you have a high probability of going to jail afterwards, at least for 2 of them. In the Philippines, you don't have to be from the same party to be president and vice president, so you can be separate. And then of the candidates, I'm hobbled by the fact that 2 may or may not make it. I would say that Grace Poe, the senator and independent, probably has the best credentials. But she's been challenged on 2 grounds. I mean, she was left on the door of a convent as a baby and adopted by Ferdinand Poe, later president. And so they ruled that she's not a Filipino citizen because she can't prove she was born there. But more to the point, she hadn't had 10 years residency in the Philippines. So she looks like to be ruled out. There have been 3 sittings of the Electoral Commission, 2 in division and nationally, and she's out. Vice President Binay is seen as very positive in the polls, but he's mired in corruption charges swirling around him and his entourage, and that's the problem. Same with the mayor of Davao, Duterte. So, Vice President Binay has the experience, though, at national government. So if I were a Filipino, couldn't vote for Grace Poe, I would vote for Binay at the moment. So we're still stuck on all of this. Because of the weak party system that you've alluded to, I think the Aquino years, which are not unmired in charges of corruption, particularly relatives running major transport networks and port authorities, but relatively better than his most recent predecessors, we face a really dismal prospect in the beginning, I think, for the Philippines, of whoever the new president is. The patronage network, the weak political parties, the closeness of the vote, and the unknowns that I've said. Will names appear on the ballot that have been disqualified? And if people vote for those people, the rule is that their votes are lost. So it's up for grabs, and I would say that of all the transitions, Thailand remaining steady state, Vietnam moving, and Myanmar, I put the Philippines as the most volatile one. And good government, that's a work in progress.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have some time for questions, about 15 minutes. If I could just remind you, please do tell us who you are, and then in the interest of time, do keep your questions brief. So if we could have the first couple of questions. I see Mike Montesano in the back, if we could have him. Do I have any other takers for the second question? Please, there are lights in my eyes, so do wave your hand a bit vigorously so I can see you. Oh, Mike? If you speak up a little louder, we can.
I have two questions for Mr. Bhaskaran. One relates to Thailand, and I wonder how one can reconcile relative optimism about Thailand with concern over debt levels, especially consumer and household debt. The second question, also for Mr. Bhaskaran, involves the Philippines, and I wonder if he can elaborate more on this easing of momentum in remittances that he observed in his talk. Thank you.
Should I take that first? Yeah. First of all, just very quickly on the Philippines, what we've noticed is the rate of growth of overseas Filipino worker OFW remittances has eased. Some of this could be simply a temporary effect of currency instability, so the remitters hold back on remitting until the exchange rates stabilize. Second fear going forward is that the Middle East takes up just slightly less than half of all deployments, and with oil prices coming down, infrastructure projects and all kinds of other works being delayed or cancelled, the demand for new deployments of foreign workers will diminish, and that will affect the growth of remittances as well. Thirdly, there's also some concern that with the Filipino economy doing much better, there are more job opportunities within the domestic economy, especially in the BPO side, and that is discouraging workers from going abroad. So there's a shift in the composition of growth in a sense. So that, I think, is the question on the Philippines. On Thailand, household debt similar to Malaysia and to some extent Singapore, there are issues with very high levels of household debt, and there is a certain degree of deleveraging going on, and that has clearly held consumer confidence back and consumer spending back. My sense is that we've had a couple of years of adjustment on that score. It is still a headwind, but it's a headwind that's losing some of its force, and at the margin, therefore, will be less of a drag on growth going into 2016 and certainly 2017.
Thank you very much. More questions? I see a hand over there. Please, yes?
Yeah, I can't see it all.
You might like to go to one of the mics?
Hi. Hello. Thank you for your sharing. I have a question regarding the South China Sea, because Philippines just filed a case to the PCA, and so did Vietnam. So my question is, how will the results of this arbitration between the Philippines and China with regards to the South China Sea affect the geopolitics in the region, especially with regards to Philippines and Vietnam?
Thank you for your question. And Miss, could you tell us your name?
Jia Hui.
Okay, thank you.
Who was it addressed to?
I think two. We can have takes from both of you on the issue.
The question is on arbitration.
Yes.
South China Sea. That's my,
Yep.
okay. We just had a little decision up here, arbitration friendly intervention. Yes, there are two things in the Philippines. The Supreme Court ruling on the enhanced defense cooperation with the United States, which has been put in abeyance and it's pending, and the results of the arbitration tribunal sometime between April and June this year, I'm told. The Philippines has made economic hay with China despite the arbitration. Its trade statistics have risen. It looks like to be continuing, the recent agreement to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's likely whoever succeeds at Kino, there's a real open question whether they will still pursue the same alignment with the U.S. and the same hard line with China, particularly if the arbitral tribunal gives a mixed decision. And China said it's going to reject it anyway. It's consolidating its position. It's already got airstrips and commercial flights doing test landings, etc. So the situation on the ground isn't going to change. It's whether a new Filipino administration really has the energy or motivation or inclination to continue to stand up the way Aquino did. And if the Supreme Court rules against the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, that makes it even worse. So that's why if you look at the very end of my paper in the handout, and I didn't get to it, I said that in all these countries, you can take the existing positions towards the US and China, and these domestic changes could see some dramatic reversals. And in the Philippines case, it could well be that. Although there's a growth of nationalism, and some of the presidential candidates have said some things critical of China, it's out of their hands. A Supreme Court decision on relations with the US, and who knows what, and then lawyers will reinterpret the arbitral tradition left, right, and center. So that's a marker, and it's an uncertainty for the future. And I'm just flagging, I don't think we can expect continuity from the Aquino administration.
Thank you very much. Yes, Susan?
How important will that, the China factor, be in the Central Committee's choice of new leadership?
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you heard it. I'm having trouble, but it was about the leadership in Vietnam and the question on China. I'll start out. There's nobody in Vietnam that is pro-China. They're pro-Vietnam. They're pro-nationalist. They're not, and the group that's considered pro-China is really what you'd call pragmatic. They're like Canadians next to America, or Mexicans. Yeah. They've got to deal with China. In those two examples, no, it's China that's the large economy, and no one in Vietnam would be foolish enough to provoke. So they try to compartmentalize South China Sea issues from the larger issues, and that's quite clear. It's a collective leadership. How much can they articulate this independently? They really can't. The whole draft political report, the draft socioeconomic plan is collective. Only the insiders know when it's released what these broad phrases mean. The new Central Committee then will set out an agenda for all its meetings. It must have two a year, and it will fine-tune. And given the balance of who's in power, they'll reinterpret the expressions of compromise in these various documents. What I was signaling is a deepening of relations with the U.S., but limited on the defense security side. The economics, what the China factor is Vietnam has a massive trade imbalance with China. Everything in Vietnam, from computers which have Chinese spyware, everything's critical. A rail project, if a worker gets killed, it's because of Chinese ineptitude. So the atmosphere isn't good. The leadership isn't going to change that. So the stance on China will be to continue to effectively engage through their joint steering committee at Deputy Prime Minister level. Both the Deputy Prime Ministers are members of the Politburo. They have a huge economic agenda, but Vietnam wants to reduce as much as possible the trade imbalance. It's never going to reduce it. And it wants it has seen the EU rise above the United States as its largest market, the US, Japan. It's moving out all that. The difference, I think, in leaders is that no one has the international experience in Nguyen Thanh Dung. His rival, the president, has traveled internationally, but the office of the prime minister and the control of those resources and the knowledge of the economy is unparalleled. No Secretary General has had that before. And the difference would be an individual who both headed the party and if his protege were prime minister, could more effectively push for reforms up to a point. But it's collective. We've seen, Prime Minister was the first to say we could take China to arbitration. The defense minister says that's a last resort. So occasionally, every now and then, we can see little differences. But I think rather than articulate policy, it's been Nguyen Thanh Dung's coming out of the gray collective leadership of becoming a vibrant personality, social media, the use of the internet, and his going around internationally. So the nature of politics in Vietnam is shifting, but as I say, it's not winner take all. And in the end, if they do agree on Nguyen Thanh Dung, then his detractors will also be given seats at the table to balance that. So that's what I think we look for, not a hostility towards China, but a deepening where it's possible across a range of issues with the US, very careful on the military security side, and to compartmentalize that issue from the larger aspects of relations with China.
Thank you very much. We're beginning to run out of time, so we do have time for one last question. If you do have something burning that you'd like to, yes, sir, please. A little louder, sir, please.
Good morning. Sorry, that's much better. A question, first of all, for Manu. Could you say a little bit more about what you see as the domestic headwinds for the Singapore economy in 2016? And for Professor Thayer, could you perhaps comment on the Filipino administration's management of the so-called Islamic State threat to the Philippines and, of course, to the wider region? Thank you.
Singapore faces a couple of domestic challenges. One is that, if you look at our cost inflation over many decades, the pattern that emerges is that until about 2006, we consistently had inflation rates below those of our trading partners. In other words, even when inflation rose, our inflation rose less than others, and we were always gaining relative competitiveness. Between 2006 and about 2011 or 2012, that reversed, and our inflation rate was significantly higher than our trading partners, and we were losing competitiveness, and that was compounded by significant appreciation of our exchange rate as well. So there's a fundamental loss of competitiveness that we have to struggle with. Secondly, and related, of course, the cost structure, wages, rentals, all kinds of intermediate services went up a lot, and we are now more expensive and provide less value for money than many of our competitor cities and business environments. So we need to do something about that. So there's got to be an adjustment in response to that loss of competitiveness. That adjustment is painful. It means re-engineering by companies. It means relocation. It means cutting costs by hopefully improving productivity. If that doesn't work, then you need to squeeze your suppliers. You need to renegotiate rental agreements with your landlords and so on. That's basically a deflationary adjustment, and that's what we are going through. The second source of headwinds is the real estate sector. We had a boom in the real estate, and now we are having indigestion. So with the supply-demand imbalance now very visible, you don't have to go very far to see how much extra supply is coming on stream. Rentals are beginning to fall, residential, commercial, office. And in addition to that, interest rates are rising. And those are two very significant triggers for a further correction in the real estate market. So I think those two challenges will be something that we have to deal with in Singapore, and it may take a couple of years. I think we will deal with it eventually, but I think for 2016 and 2017, we should not expect a huge acceleration in economic growth, even with a revival in global demand, until we've sorted out these domestic issues.
Thank you.
All right, the question on ISIS in the southern Philippines is that Aquino has tried to pursue ceasefire and autonomy legislation, but that's been thwarted in Congress, so that's going to be left for the new administration. That there are groups that did not agree and have splintered off from those who accepted the earlier ceasefire, and they've just recently declared their allegiance to the distant caliphate themselves. And so the question is, how much traction will they gain? And we have later a whole panel on that, so I'll throw over the more detailed analysis to that. So we have a group in the South declaring its loyalty to ISIS. How much is that more than just a name calling, like identifying with Al-Qaeda because it makes you sound really important and in there. But we do have some armed groups, but they're in the hundreds. And finally, I was asked, the evaluation was that Aquino couldn't get it through Congress. He's also been criticized because there was an ambush where police went after a terrorist suspect and took a large number of fatal casualties, and he was seen not to be reacting very strongly to that. So the issue is it's now into the lap of the new president and the next administration.
Thank you very much. Lamentably, we have run out of time, and we do have a very interesting panel following this one. So we've had a very comprehensive take on the economic and the political scenario facing the region, as well as the identification of key stress points and markers for us to look for. So please join me in thanking our two panelists for very effective presentations.